So we'll be continuing The Light of Egypt by Thomas B. Burgoyne, Chapter 6, The Mysteries of Sex. It has been well said by eminent occultists, man is most ignorant of those things which are most manifest. In some departments of nature, this is true, and probably in no other manifested department of his being is this truth more strictly apparent than that in which relates to his sexual nature. It is aware that animal nature is divided into two classes, male and female, but he knows almost nothing of the spiritual principles which underlie the physical expression of sex. He is fully aware that the union of the two organisms is necessary for the purpose of procreation, but he is fearfully ignorant of those interior processes which produce the actual germs of life. He is more or less acquainted with the fact that in his lower stratus, an animated existence is bisexual. Bisexual organisms are the general rule, and that occasionally this bisexual nature becomes manifested among men, as seen in the hermaphrodite. But he is quite at loss to account for such monstrous productions. Hence, it may be truly said that man is most ignorant of those things which are most manifest. Therefore, in order to enable the general reader to clearly grasp the various connecting links and the mystical ramifications of sex, to see their perfect harmony, and to understand their relation to each other, we will first speak of the origin of sex. Secondly, describe as clearly as possible its nature and functions. Thirdly, point out the relation of the sexes to each other. And lastly, present a brief application of the whole as it relates to man, universe, and the immortality of the soul. 1. The origin of sex. Deity is a unity that expresses or manifests itself as a duality. This is the eternal trinity of life, the infinite ocean of formless spirit within its latent bosom contains all that is, was, or ever can be. Therefore, it contains all the elements of sex in their primal state. When the first pulsation of the thought which evolved the divine idea became manifest, nature arrayed herself under the two modes of motion, action and reaction. The in-breathing and out-breathing of this divine thought in the earliest dawn of creation thus instituted the first spiritual attributes of sex. Each function of the deific soul, which we designate as inspiration and respiration, or action and reaction of the universal life current, thus became differentiated for all eternity as the primary fundamental principle of manifested being. The Kabbalistical initiates of the ages that are gone formulated this same biune spirit as love and wisdom. Love, as the negative or feminine ray, is content and ever seeks to enfold. Wisdom, as the positive masculine ray, is restless and always in pursuit. The feminine forces are ever striving to encircle the atom, and the masculine forces striving to propel it in a straight line. From this dual action of the spiritual potentialities is born the spiral, the motion of life and symbol of eternal progression. We cannot attempt any explanation of how the first deific forms of sexual life become ultimated, nor of the why and wherefore of this celestial existence. It is enough for us that we are enabled by the laws of correspondence to trace the origin of sex to the shores of the great fountain of all existence, and to proclaim it to the world as the first principle of the great central ego, God, from which all manifested egos deserve their being. In order that we may comprehend somewhat of the mysteries of sex as we see them manifested in humanity, we must descend from these practically inconceivable heights of celestial glory and seek for the links of this continuous chain within the highest states of life, approachable by the embodied human soul, the angelic sphere of the soul world. Only in these states can we obtain any definite idea of the interior significance of sex and its mighty importance as a factor in the immortality of the human soul. The first link of this celestial chain, as we have seen, lies concealed within the bosom of the Infinite One. What the succeeding ones may contain, we cannot tell, but that they will bear a perfect correspondence to the angelic state, we are certain, making due allowance for the difference of their respective states. Therefore, since we know the origin of sex, we will consider its correlatives, which we have designated as inspiration and respiration. 2, sex, its nature, and functions. In the previous chapter, we have described in a very brief manner the actual differentiation of the human ego as a deific atom of life. We need not therefore repeat any of the description there given, but we will add that it must be a self-evident fact that each ego contains within itself all the primary elements of sex in a latent condition. These attributes have not as yet been subjected to the requisite conditions for their evolution. In this state, then, there is neither love nor wisdom manifested within the ego. It cannot know happiness when it is ignorant of sorrow. It cannot form any conception of rest before weariness has approached. There can be no real love for the ego when it has never experienced the various contrary conditions by which love is distinguished. The wisdom of the ego in this state is equally latent, since it possesses no means of arriving at a true knowledge of its various surroundings. In this state, we behold the spiritual atom in its primal condition, wherein the power of God hath just created it. It is the first spiritual atom. The various series of states through which this divine ego must penetrate in order to evolve its soul sphere are the necessary means by which the internal potentialities of sex must be awakened. When this transpires, the divine ego becomes pregnant with the dual forms of its own organic life, and the twin souls are born, the male and female elements of its being, which are represented in Genesis as Adam and Eve, knowing neither good nor evil. A beautiful description, this of the embryonic human souls. These twin souls are the absolute expression of the masculine and feminine rays of which every absolute atomic ego is composed. The masculine ray contains a portion of the feminine elements, or there could be no reaction of its forces. The feminine ray must likewise contain a portion of the masculine qualities for the same reason. These twin souls contain a portion of each other. They constitute the sun and the moon, so to say, of the ego's creation. And when once they become differentiated, they are as eternal and immortal as the ego, which called them into existence. They can be neither absorbed nor annihilated by time nor eternity. They constitute the divine idea of their deific parent, and as such, they become the divine expression of love and wisdom upon this earth. Note, this statement requires some slight qualification. We mean that no foreign or outside influence can absorb or annihilate the sexual qualities of the soul. It is therefore true that the masculine and feminine attributes of the soul cannot be destroyed as a whole, but the masculine portion may attract its feminine portion or soulmate, and by the intense selfhood of its own dominant forces, virtually destroy her manifested existence. This absorption, however, is a very rare occurrence and only transpires in the case of those magical adepts of the astral plane who have attained their psychological powers by a complete polarization of all the truly human elements of their eternal natures. Such magical adepts become the concentrated centers of the spiritual selfishness, but teach the external masses that self is the very demon they have conquered. These occult processes have transformed them into sexless beings who are neither human nor divine, and yet they profess to be the guardians of the secret doctrine of the sacred science. In this latter capacity, they have formulated much erroneous philosophy, since they are self-magnetized and self-deluded by their own positive idea of nature to such an extent that they cannot penetrate beyond their own astral spheres, nor receive any knowledge which elevates the soul to higher views and truer conceptions of God's infinite resources. It is from this magical school of thought that mankind have received the doctrines which teach that sex is only the appearance of matter and not a spiritual reality, whereas nothing in this mighty universe is so manifest and so eternal as the male and female expressions of the divine soul. These adepts profess to have blended the two, but they have simply polarized the feminine and created a conscious selfhood of the other. It is impossible for the absolute ego, the twin soul, to descend into more outward conditions than the paradisical state. So in order to attain the full development of its internal attributes, its own soul, expressed as the male and female elements, each unit is projected outward upon the subjective arc of the great cycle, where, after passing through innumerable spheres and states of life, each finally reaches the polarizing point of creation in the mineral, which is the turning point in its cycle of necessity. From this point, its journey back is traversed upon the objective arc until it reaches the climax of material forms. We see, therefore, that the nature of sex is to give perfect expression to the two grand attributes of deific life, love and wisdom. That to attain this end, the divine soul of the absolute ego becomes differentiated as male and female, each conscious of itself, each a perfect expression of the positive and negative forces of its being. When once this differentiation is completed, then they exist as the divine idea of the microcosm and constitute its universe, even as the myriad creations of space constitute the divine idea of the deity. This being so, each portion of the dual soul maintains forever the perfect symbol of its internal qualities and always gives expression in its outward form to the symbol of its internal nature. Like produces like. The function of the soul is to awaken and round out those qualities and attributes which are latent within. And as we have seen, that there are two sets of soul qualities. One, the necessary outcome of the other. We see the harmony and the philosophy of the twin forms of life to express them, both male and female, as we have endeavored to show, possess the necessary positive qualities for the perfect subjugation of material forces. Hence, it is that when the twin souls are projected on their journey into matter, they travel upon divergent lines, upon the subjective arcs of the soul's evolution. These lines, if it were possible to measure them, would form two sides of an equilateral triangle with mineral at base, while the apex would indicate the absolute ego or point of projection. The return journey between the mineral and man forms a singular triangle in reverse, which would indicate the objective arcs of the soul's evolution. When both arcs are combined, they represent the mystical seal of King Solomon, the double trinity, a six-pointed star. This completes two acts in the grand drama of life. The closing tableau in the first act represents the stationary forces of the crystallized mineral. In the second act, the external conditions of human life. So I just want to iterate that they just gave an expression of life, you know, the Constitution, and as represented in the triangle reverse, which gives you as above, so below, like my ring, the X alpha, right? And they'll promote that as being a Jewish something for the Jews, or the state. It's Star of David, right? Or yeah, the corporation flag for the state of Israel that's attempting to colonize Palestine. It's in the middle, but it's powder blue or blue. You know what I'm saying? But as you can see, that has nothing to do with that. You know what I mean? Right. Yeah. And I like this breakdown too, how it's a cycle of life. You know what I mean? So many meanings, 7 different meanings there. Like, it's more in depth. It kind of go more, you know what I mean? And the same thing, the yin and the yang, right? Because on the solid black side, it's a little bit of white, and on the solid white side, it's a little bit of black. You know what I mean? It's a little bit of feminine. Yeah. Islam. You know what I mean? Yeah. You know what I mean? It's good. The people. Yeah. People need to know this, you know. They didn't know what this real, you know, Tahuti stuff is about, you know. Because we know Jew. So we know when we say Jew, right? It was no J, right? So they're really saying Tahuti. All right? Yeah. So one that knows knowledge, right? Tahuti. So everybody that's illuminated or enlightened, or if that eye on top of the pyramid is connected, you enlightened, right? You beaming. You now become a Jew. You know what's really going on the earth. The real politics. You're not behind the veil, you know what I mean? Yeah, you know. All right, Islam. It's loud. All right. I'm gonna pick back up. I'm gonna pick back up where we left off. Um, so subjective arc and objective arc, Solomon's seal. The third and last act in the human cycle briefly reviews the whole of the previous two arcs and evolves other six-pointed star, which represents the higher and lower planes of manifestation. This last act is the transit of the soul through the seven super mundane spheres of the disembodied existence from man to the angel. So I'm gonna run that back from the top. Subjective arc and objective arc, Solomon's seal. The third and last act in the human cycle briefly reviews the whole of the previous two arcs and evolves another six-pointed star, which represents the higher and lower planes of manifestation. This last act is the transit of the soul through the seven super mundane spheres of disembodied existence from man to angel. But in its grand outlines, it is also a spiritual trine whose closing tableau represents the reunion of the twin souls, symbolized by St. John as the celestial marriage of the Lamb. Thus, we begin with the one divine monad or ego, and in the course of its expression and of the gradual evolution of its sexual attributes, we see it slowly transform into a trinity. This trinity, in the subcycles of its evolution, forms three triangles, which constitute the symbol of its forces, three times expressed upon the three subcycles of the journey, or of its journey. These three subcycles are the subjective arc of the cycle of unconsciousness, the objective arc or cycle of intelligence, and the ethereal arc or cycle of soul consciousness. The results so far of our present research show that the origin of sex begins with God, that the nature of sex is the manifestation of his biune spirit, and its functions are the spiral motion of its evolutionary forces that awaken and round out its latent possibilities. It now becomes our duty to consider the third section of our subject, the relation of the sexes to each other. Part 3. The relation of the sexes to each other. Male and female exist in nature as the representative expressions of wisdom and love. Their functions correspond exactly with their sex. And in actual life, it may be truly said that woman is ever the center of the love element of humanity. Her thoughts and desires constitute the index of her mission on earth. In her, we behold the gentle, yielding, loving nature which softens and harmonizes man's positive spirit of aggression. In her delicate nature, we see the lovely center of maternal care and affection. She is the weaker portion of the dual of dual soul upon the physical plane, but her physical weakness constitutes the greater center of her spiritual strength. As the weaker sex, we may think that her true place is the subjection to man, but on the contrary, her more delicate forces become more potent weapon, and instead of being the subject, she ascends the throne of the conqueror. Man becomes a pliable medium in her hands and is led a willing captive by her subtle power and resources. In man, we behold the positive, aggressive Lord of creation, that portion of the soul which becomes the restless explorer of nature seeking for wisdom. Man's will is electric, penetrating, and disruptive. The will of woman is magnetic, attractive, and formative. Hence, they express the polar opposites of nature's forces. The twin souls are related to each other primarily as brother and sister, and finally as man and wife. In this later state, or latter state, their true meeting place is the plane of embodied humanity. But during the present cycle, very few of these spiritual unions take place. But whenever the two halves of the same divine ego do meet, love is the natural consequence, but not the physical sensations produced by the animal magnetisms of their sexual natures, but the deep silent emotions of the soul, the responsive vibrations of their internal nature towards each other, the blissful silence of two souls in perfect rapport, within neither careth to speak. This spiritual love is the outcome of their divine relationship and should never be set aside nor crushed by any worldly considerations. But on the contrary, whenever possible, these pure intuitions of the soul should be obeyed. They cannot deceive nor lead astray, because the soul never makes a mistake when claiming its own. Should circumstances in life or any other material consideration prevent their rightful union, the fact that they have actually met will constitute an invisible connection, a spiritual rapport between them, which no earthly power or device can break. Deep down within the secret chambers of the heart, the image of the loved one will be treasured, and its continual presence will poison and corrode everything which pertains toward an ephemeral affection for another. If a female should marry under these circumstances and become the mother of children, it will frequently transpire that the actual germs of spiritual life will be transmitted by the absent one. The external husband only provides the purely physical conditions for the manifestation of the spiritual offspring of the true Lord. The rejected soulmate, the spiritual bridegroom, is the real father, and very often the child born will resemble the image of its true parent. By far the most important of the various relations of the sexes towards each other is that which pertains to their sexual intercourse. Untold misery, suffering, and crime are born into the world through the sensual depravity of mankind on the one hand, and their benighted ignorance of human nature upon the other. We are sorry that such a delicate subject cannot be properly treated in this present work. So we will only add that man and wife should harmonize with each other, both in physical temperament and in magnetic polarity. No marriage union should be thought of where these essential points of comparison are wanting. Neither wealth, fame, nor worldly position can compensate for the lack of natural harmony. Discordant unions are the harbingers of sorrow, crime, and disease. Sexual union between inharmonious souls evolves the seeds of every species of wickedness and sexual disorder. It may not become apparent to the producer thereof, but it exists within spaces of human life, ready to spring into the concrete form under the first favorable conditions. Let those deliberately misuse their sexual nature to satisfy licentious, wicked desires stop in the deadly path. Such thoughts and actions lead to madness and actual death. The purely martial man will prove a continual curse to the cold, nature Saturnine woman, and vice versa. This may not be any fault of the man or woman, but it is the discordant polarities of their astral constitutions. The same will hold good between natures of the earthly triplicity and those born under the airy triplicity. The true knowledge of the science of the stars is necessary to determine conjugal harmony or discord. Now, the various sections of our subject are completed, and it only remains for us to apply the logical outcome of the principles of sex as they affect man, the universe, and the immortality of the soul. As we view the outward forms of man and woman, we cannot fail to observe the perfect harmony between the external appearance and the internal cause. Their organisms are the concrete image of the principles concealed within. It would be the extreme height of absurdity for us to believe that a materialized form bears no correspondence to the forces which created it. The form cannot exist without an internal cause, and the internal cause is powerless to produce any external form apart from the reflected image of itself and its functions. Under these circumstances, it must be self-evident that every male organism is the absolute outcome of masculine forces, and every female organism is the product of feminine qualities. Therefore, the male soul cannot be born into the world under the cover of a female form. Neither can a female soul be ushered upon the plains of humanity imprisoned within the masculine body. These are nature's simple facts, which ought to be apparent these are nature's simple facts, which ought to be apparent to every thinking mind. But it seems that such is not the case, for we are seriously informed by certain theosophical writers that during the various incarnations of the human soul within the human form, man may incarnate in the form of a woman and vice versa. We can only say that such unutterable nonsense is almost beneath the notice of any sane mind. And those who make such ridiculous assertions are not only bound to the external plane of appearances, but are completely ignorant to the true light of occult science. It often transpires that we find men who appear to possess true feminine natures and women who seem to be masculine in temperament. But this is not really the case. It is only an appearance caused by the combined influence of prenatal conditions, the stellar positions at birth, the Buddhistical conception of man and woman rounding out until sex becomes obliterated. It's probably the most transcendental delusion that ever originated within the Oriental brain. Therefore, we will take no further notice of such mystical folly. The human form, as male and female, is the material culmination of nature's sexual expression. Upon this plane, she can go no further, for beyond this limit, we step within the spaces of the ether where nature combines or nature continues her wonderful expression of sex in strict harmony with the laws of correspondence to the planes below. While dealing with the forms assumed by man, we must briefly notice those vital secretions which form the physical conditions for reproduction of his kind. The seminal fluids are the most ethereal of all physical secretions and contain the very quintessence of human nature. The sexual organism exists as a factor of procreation. Therefore, the organs have their proper functions and use, or they would not be present. To suddenly and completely suppress their natural functions will do a great deal of physical and spiritual harm, because the reaction will create violent discord within the ethereal constitution. In fact, the complete suppression is almost as bad as excessive use or lustful indulgence. It is only one of the two extremes, nothing more. When the sexual organism is evolved above the physical plane of manifestation, the seminal fluids are absorbed by the magnetic constitution, and the etherealized atoms help to build up the spiritual body of man. But this is not so these seminal germs, if not passed off amid the other secretions from the body, live and germinate a swarm of elemental life forms which rob the organism of a portion of its vitality. To obey the laws of nature is the only safe and sure road to evolve the spiritual senses of the soul. And one of these laws is the rightful union of the sexes. Celibacy in itself is not a natural state. It is purely artificial because it ignores one of the principal elements of our being. Therefore, this is a great spiritual danger. Therefore, there is great spiritual danger in a celibate life. And 9/10 of the mystical mamas and spiritual saturnalia of past history have originated among celibates. It is well to remember this at a present day, as there is some considerable danger of history repeating itself. Celibacy as a quick means of artificially stimulating and producing certain so-called spiritual producers and mediumistic states is a successful medium so far as mere psychological results are concerned, but one that is fraught with terrible danger. It is a method that should be discouraged in all cases within the spiritual constitution of the organism is in a negative condition. Under the most favorable circumstances, it is a very questionable practice unless the spiritual nature is sufficiently active to absorb and use the etherealized atoms of the seminal fluid, which has become dematerialized by the magnetic activities of occult training. Any species of forcing the attributes of the soul renders their manifestations weak and unhealthy, hence liable to error and delusion. It is upon this basis that we account for the spiritual absurdities of many Oriental mystics. Their severe asceticism renders them the unsuspecting prey of every imaginable species of occult delusion. Celibacy, then, must only take place when the animal nature has been evolved so far upward toward the higher principles that the sexual propensities are susceptible of extending their vibrations to a higher plane of action. In this case, celibacy becomes an absolute necessity of further occult progress. Herein, we see once more the paradox of truth. Upon one plane, it becomes a delusion and a snare, but upon a higher plane, it contains all the elements of a glorious truth. Consequently, no being, human or divine, can lay down any hard and fast line to guide the various processes of spiritual development. Each organism requires a system that is peculiar to itself. Each soul, a training specially adapted to the plane it occupies. From this, it will be seen that nothing more than the general principles of occult training can be given. From such outlines, each must adapt such rules and exercises as are applicable to him as he learns from self-study and practice. And only those who are themselves spiritually enlightened can see the true state of the soul and physician-like scientifically prescribe for its various disorders. When we regard the mystical ramifications of sex as represented in the universal creations of suns, stars, moons, and planets, we see the same principles at work throughout every department of their being, even to their shape and the form of orbit. The suns are masculine and represent the cosmic male spirit. The planets are feminine and consequently become the fruitful wombs of progressive life. The moons are neither the one nor the other. They are the conflicting offspring of disturbing forces within the suns and its planet. They are the lowest organic expression of planetary life, and as such, represent the state of the hermaphrodite. So, both in man and in universe, the potentialities of sex swing the mighty pendulum of thought and motion. The grand object which the divine ego seeks to realize in the evolution of the human soul is the complete differentiation of its latent attributes. The soul must become the expression of both its qualities and must express the true nature of the biune spirit. Hence, male and female evolution is the outcome. Each soul rounds out and completes, so to say, its own section of the ego. And in doing this, it becomes individualized as a complete expression of one ray of the divine idea. Hence, it is a perfect identity with its source. Both male and female complete the whole and are related to each other as Osiris and Isis, brother and sister. Their individuality in the form of their spiritual identity is forever preserved, and they're united as well as their separate consciousness becomes an attribute of their glorious immortality. Without sex, there cannot be eternal life. And to absorb or destroy these principles in the human organism brings about a divorce between man and his divinity, and thus robs consciousness, and thus robs conscious humanity of its deathless immortality. So they were saying a sun, moon, planets, and they were saying the sun and the moon are not considered planets, but they do represent male and female. And I believe that they said the planets. There you go. Oh no, we're gonna run this back. Once we put this on YouTube, we're gonna run it back. I mean, I don't know if this is another chapter, or is this, or is this another section?
Yeah, it's like it.
I'm gonna read a little bit of it because it's like interesting. The mystery of Isis. The human organism, in its more interior sense, is the mystical uterus of Isis. That is, the human organism is the uterus of nature, ever pregnant with the Holy Ghost, the incarnated soul, which, when the period of gestation is completed, the cycle of evolution shall give birth to the Son of God, whose kingdom is not of this earth, but of heaven. This means the soul, which has attained its immortality, is the Son of God, etc., whose future state of being is the boundless realm of spirit. I and the Father are one, meaning that the human ego is but an atom of the Father, is not the same idea as the more interior state of adeptship or being at one with God. That this at one-ment is the mystical atonement of the Christ or spirit within the human soul. You are at peace with your spiritual conscious. These ideas, if meditated upon, will reveal unto you the whole mystery of Christ and the Immaculate Conception. The idea of the human organism being the mystical womb of nature was the cause of the ancient priest of the sanctuary elaborating the magnificent funerals, the cremation of the Hindu, the Greek and Roman rites, and embalming of the Egyptians. It was the most important ceremony of ancient times because the most mystically important and most sublime rite that the soul can pass from matter to spirit or back to the Father's home. I'm gonna stop it right there as far as the recording.